From the Battle Sisters of Warhammer 40k to American Horror Stories' Sister Mary Eunice, sexy and murderous nuns have long been a key pillar of the Christian faith. In Trench Crusade, Factory Fortress has paid homage to this with their stigmatic nun sculpt. Today, I'll be walking you through how I painted this pious lady. For this skin, I'm starting with a base coat of Pro Acryl Burnt Red. Afterwards, I create a mixture of burnt red and faded green. I don't have a precise recipe, but I'm using two gradients you can see me mix right now. One is more red, and one uses more of the green. The red and the green partially neutralize each other, creating a vaguely pinkish tone. I cover most of the skin with the reddish mixture. I'm leaving the under boob and under booty burnt red to create a shadow. Now I'm using the greenish, or rather the mixture with more green in it, to layer up the skin. I decided to do another layer, adding in pink to the previous mixture. If you wanted to, you could probably just skip straight to this mixture, though you would need to do more coats. Once I'm happy with the coverage, I call this good for the skin. I'm leaving the boobies blank, as I'll be adding freehand to them later. For the armor, I'm putting down a base coat of Pro Acryl Black Green. Next, I'm layering with Pro Acryl Green. I cover most of the armor with this, leaving the crevices black green and the sides of the helmet. After dealing with a cat attack, I created a mixture of black green and green. I believe it was about 1/3 black green, 2/3 green. I paint the sides of the helmet with this color and the inner part of the legs to create a shadow effect. Now comes the fun part. Minimalist camera work means the bismuth yellow got cut off, but it's what I'm mixing with the green. I started with about 1/4 yellow to begin with. I'm hitting the upper parts where an overhead light would hit if shown from above. I also paint the raised edges of the pauldrons at this point. Particularly like the sharp divide between the light and the dark shadow on the legs. This is basically a non-metallic metal look, but I'm keeping it very basic as it's meant to be a relatively quick tabletop paint job. For a more serious non-metallic look, you would just start bringing the highlights higher, the shadows darker, and then just blend it until you lose your mind. Speaking of higher highlights though, I am adding another layer of them. I mix in more bismuth yellow. This time it's about 50-50 bismuth yellow and green. This makes the brightest non-fluorescent green I've ever seen. I use this to reinforce the highlights in a few key areas where I think the light would hit the hardest and the edges of the pauldrons. The final part of the armor is some sweet, sweet black lining, or rather black-green lining at this point. I like to reserve the actual black lining for divides between different materials, such as armor and skin. With the black green, I'm just putting back in any divisions between the armor plates I may have painted over, and putting in a shadow by the raised edges of the pauldrons. For the loincloth, I'm doing a red-blue checkered pattern. Checkers are a very basic type of freehand and a good place to start if you're wanting to learn how to freehand. I'm starting by base coating it with dark blue. Next, I'm painting a grid with burnt red. Based on experience, I'm planning on doing a 3 square wide pattern, So I paint 2 vertical red lines. You can do more, or even less if you want to. The process is the same. Your vertical lines will be the number of columns minus 1. In general, I recommend the smallest number of columns that you think will still look good. Remember, it's just paint. You can paint over it if you make a mistake or if you decide you want a different number of columns. This part of the model is pretty flat and it will take many layers of paint before you start to build up a texture or obscure detail. Now I'm putting in the horizontal lines. I'm just eyeballing what I think looks good size-wise and not counting the number that I'm putting down. Remember, you can always paint over it and try again. Burnt red is covered pretty well by dark blue. Once your grid is down, the hard parts are over. I pick a random square and fill it in with burnt red. Then I fill in all the squares diagonal to that one with burnt red. Repeat until every other square is filled in. Because I'm filling in with the same color I drew the lines with, I often find that the red squares are a bit thicker than the blue ones, so I do some fixing with dark blue until the squares are more equal in size. Highlighting up the squares will also make the size discrepancies a little less notable. Remember, some imperfections are fine and probably less noticeable than you think. If your OCD is getting you stuck on this step, I recommend taking an edible. For the blue highlights, I just paint a layer of blue, then sky blue. For the red, I layer with Pyrrole Bold Red. Then, since red is a fairly transparent color, I put in some white highlights before going over the white highlights with orange red. Now for something really simple. My wood recipe is just a 50-50 mix of Citadel Gore-Grunta and Citadel Wildwood contrast paint. Plain Wildwood is a little too neutral for my taste, so I add the Gore-Grunta fur to it to warm it up. Then I just paint it over the wood. Because this is contrast, it only works over a white or gray base coat. Zenithal works best, but flat white is fine if you don't have an airbrush. After the contrast dries, I do an edge highlight with Pro Acryl Caramel. And I'm doing this on the 3D printed base I have, as well as the handles of her mason axe. For the steel parts, I start with a base coat of dark gray blue. Afterwards, I cover most of the dark gray blue with neutral gray, avoiding the recesses. Then I highlight the neutral gray with warm gray. I'm shifting from the cooler neutral and blue gray of the previous parts to a warm color as a way of subtly increasing the contrast, and that they represent sunlight reflecting off of the metal. Finally, I mix in some bright pale yellow to the warm gray and do a small final highlight. On the weapons, I do a little bit of scratchiness with them to add some visual interest. For the gold, I'm base coating with bright yellow ochre. The gold I paint for this style is really just a bright saturated yellow, but I love it. While I wait for it to dry, I paint the dirt with dark umber. Then I go back and add a layer of bismuth yellow over the bright yellow ochre. Easy peasy, lemon yellow. On the gold tablet, there's a little cross indentation. I fill it in with some Gore-Grunta fur contrast to provide some more contrast. Then I do a couple of highlights with bright pale yellow, and we're done. with the gold.
Alright, so before we get into the freehand section, I thought I would just show you guys on a piece of paper with a pen the basics of what I'm doing. With freehand, I like to start by just doing lines and then kind of expanding them out into the shape. So for the iron cross that we're using on her tatas, I'm going to start by doing a simple plus sign. Just 2 lines centered on the nib. And then I do more straight lines at the end of the plus signs. And then finally, all I'm doing is doing a little swooping brush stroke like that. I start at the center point and end at the end of the plus sign, because when you're painting, most of the paint comes off of your brush at the end of the stroke. And due to the scale that I'll be painting on, this pretty much fills in just with that brush stroke. So then you just do brush strokes, curve. And as you can see here, you don't have to be very good at drawing in order to be good at painting, fortunately.
Here I'm making the same plus sign topped with lines that you just saw me draw, this time using Contrast Black Legion. This video is playing at 200% speed, so I'm actually painting very slowly for this. You'll notice I do a couple of strokes to fill in one side, and then do the other side of the iron cross in the opposite direction compared to what I was drawing. This is due to me not thinking. But after touching up with some of the flesh tone mix from earlier, we're looking decent. Note that the bottom part of the iron cross isn't really important since it's hidden by the under boobie. I started on her stomach tats while waiting for some paint to dry on her left martyr milker, since it took me a few tries to get that one right. I'm sketching out the letters with Fire Slayer Flesh contrast paint so it's easier to paint over if I make a mistake. My plan with the placement is to do 2 letters on each side of her stomach. Once I'm happy with the placement, I go over it in black. If you're uncomfortable writing with a paintbrush, you can practice a few times on a sheet of paper. With the bottom word consisting of 5 letters, I center the 3rd letter directly under her belly button. Finally, I finish her off with some blood splatter. I'm just taking a toothbrush and dipping it in some Army Painter blood effect paint. I then run a finger down the bristle, spraying blood over the mini. Afterwards, I rim the base in caramel, and we're done. Now our nun is ready to slaughter heretics and arouse the faithful. If you want to see more Trench Crusade, just let me know in the comments and tell me what your favorite faction is.